Are paraphilias actually real and supported by science? Stick around. Welcome back to another episode of Just a Tip with Dr. Vic / Sex Nerd Podcast. My name is Dr. Victoria Hartman. Now, as some of you are aware, I have based my entire career on the study of paraphilias. Now, what are paraphilias? Loosely defined, they are unusual sexual interests or sexual interests that aren't represented overwhelmingly in the mainstream, although some researchers like Justin Lane Miller have published books on how common sexual fantasies are and paraphilias are. However, I've based my career on the study of paraphilias. It's actually been very fascinating. I'm still fascinated by it. I also have a background in pornography valuations, forensic sexology, looking at adult materials or sexuality in general through a forensic lens. So I wear a lot of hats. I never really, though, thought I would be questioning or asking the question, I should say, are paraphilias even real and backed by science? Until I read a paper by a colleague, in fact, Michael Bailey, and a co-author of his, Kevin Hsu. And they were looking at research on chronophilias. I'm going to skip that part and get right into what I consider the meat of the paper, which is questioning the science around paraphilias in general. The great thing about science is you're often wrong and you get to learn something. It teaches you humility. It also provides with unending mystery. So let's dive into the mystery. Now, there's this ongoing debate in sexology that paraphilias or sexual interests are actually orientations. They're sexual orientations. We've seen that debate happen around people who are attracted to, say, robots or feet or clothing. And that it's because it's lifelong and because it remains constant throughout the lifespan, that perhaps it's less a paraphilia, which has moral and ethical implications, and in fact is an orientation because it manifests young and it spans the life of a person. However, and they challenge that here, and I will dive into that for a moment. Now, the authors of this paper reference Cito, that he did a paper in 2016, who suggested we define sexual orientation expansively as a stable tendency to preferentially orient in terms of attention, interest, attraction, and genital arousal to particular classes of sexual stimuli. He continues, if we accept this broader definition, then we can imagine that individuals actually have multiple sexual orientations rather than a single sexual orientation corresponding to their sexual preferences along a variety of different dimensions, including, along a variety of different dimensions. So his argument is because, and like I just said, because sexual interests are constant over the course of one's life, that perhaps this is an orientation similar to, say, heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality. The authors of this paper state, for several reasons, we believe that this approach is unhelpful. First, sexual orientation has routinely been distinguished from sexual identity and sexual behavior because of the recognition of that the three characteristics can diverge. Consider, for example, a heterosexually married man who only has sex with his wife, identifies as bisexual, but whose sexual fantasies are exclusively about men. We think it is most accurate to say that he has a heterosexual behavioral pattern, a bisexual identity, and most likely a homosexual orientation. To define his sexual orientation broadly, depending on which aspect of sexual orientation one is talking about, is confusing. offering multiple different definitions of one term is rarely a good scientific approach. The authors here argue that paraphilias not only are more often found in men, but that men's sexual orientation is their sexual arousal pattern. They state for men, sexual orientation is equivalent to their sexual arousal pattern. For example, heterosexual men experience much greater sexual arousal when interacting with, fantasizing about, or viewing erotica depicting women than they do when interacting with, fantasizing about, or viewing erotica depicting men. Homosexual men show the opposite pattern. So their argument here in the paper is that a man's sexual orientation is his sexual arousal pattern, which isn't as common in women, apparently. There's argument for this particular proposal of what sexual orientation is. They respond with, our proposed definition of sexual orientation is not only methodologically convenient due to the objective nature of genital arousal assessment, sexual arousal patterns are subjectively and developmentally crucial to understanding one's own sexual orientation. We believe that men who must learn they have unusual sexual orientations or preferences do so because of their sexual arousal pattern. They go on. Our proposed definition of sexual orientation does not generally apply to women. Men, but not women, show a category-specific pattern of genital arousal with respect to gender. In contrast, both homosexual and heterosexual men, heterosexual women, to both homosexual and heterosexual men, heterosexual women show an indifferent pattern of genital arousal when they're exposed to different kinds of stimuli, and homosexual women show a diminished category-specific pattern of genital arousal, but with a smaller difference in arousal to stimulus categories compared with men. Although first demonstrated for genital arousal, the sex difference in category specificity has been demonstrated for other measures associated with sexual arousal, such as neural activation to erotic stimuli. Dr. Bailey proposed that most women, especially heterosexual women, may not have a sexual orientation. Readers who do not wish to contemplate that degree of divergence between the sexes must nevertheless agree that sexual orientation appears to work differently in men and women. This sex difference is not a problem in considering various kinds of paraphilias. Indeed, it is consistent with sex differences in their occurrence. Here's where they dive into the area that I'm interested in specifically. The authors write, we both have admitted that paraphilias is a vague concept and made scientific arguments premised on its validity. That represents the non-ideal current state of knowledge. Scientists have too long neglected to study the construct validity of paraphilias as a general category. To the extent that different paraphilias have shared causes and similar expressions, construct validity of the general category of paraphilia is supported. Otherwise, the complaint that labeling sexual interests as paraphilias represents only the value judgments that they are weird and problematic needs to be taken seriously. Beyond the lack of scientific progress regarding the validity of paraphilias in general, an interesting characteristic of paraphilia is that some of them co-occur within an individual far more often than one would expect by chance. So there's often co-occurring sexual interests. Now, they further argue that even if paraphilias are ultimately vindicated as a valid category, that sexual orientation and sexual interests may be an evolutionary adaptive function, and that those who are, let's say, more oriented towards their paraphilia than what would be considered normative behavior. And in this case, they use the example of a preference for fertile women by men is likely an adaptation whose particular mechanisms consist of both excitatory and inhibitory mechanisms, increased sexual arousal to fertile women, and importantly, mechanisms that sexually discriminate against humans that are somewhat similar, but at an unfertile level of sexual maturity. So they're stating here that being sexually oriented towards the opposite sex and towards fertility might be an evolutionary response, and that paraphilias are an inversion of that response. So it would be the opposite of an adaptive developmental program. They finish with, this is the least specific and most speculative idea we have offered, and we do not expect it will be useful anytime soon. However, it seems to us the more consistent with what we know about paraphilias, which are associated with preferred sexual targets that differ dramatically rather than subtly from typical sexual targets. Furthermore, their hypothesis is consistent with cases mentioned in Cito's paper in 2016. So, and I read a different paper that explored this a little bit more, and I don't have it in front of me right now. But this is an interesting idea that we as sexological researchers perhaps have not explored the idea of whether or not paraphilias are a valid construct, if they have construct validity. If we're basing it on they seem to remain consistent over the lifespan, well, but that only applies to men, and that their orientation is their sexual arousal pattern, at the very least it calls into question, or it begs for more investigation as to whether or not the idea of paraphilia is a valid construct to begin with. Because if something that's lifelong and consistent is only being seen in men, and women are more fluid and don't seem to have that same kind of consistency or constancy, I should say, can what's considered an orientation be called an orientation? Or can you apply the word orientation to sexual interest? Now, I've explored this a little bit in one of my previous episodes where I asked the question, how many people are aware of our 3 orientations? And I brought up, actually, when I was talking to Dr. Jobin, I brought up that we have 3 quote unquote orientations, 2 of which are not being defined as such. And I discussed that we have our sexual orientation, which is gay, straight, bi. Our romantic or relational orientation, are we monogamous, non-monogamous, and what way are we non-monogamous? And our erotic orientation, which is our arousal pattern, right? The things that turn us on, which are generally defined as paraphilias when they step outside of, anything that constitutes or what's considered vanilla. So there's a lot to consider in this paper. They do make a good argument, or at least they point out the holes in the idea of what a paraphilia is, or how it should be defined, or if it could be classified as an orientation. There are some questions as homosexuality. There's these questions now that are being asked about how valid is the construct of the idea of paraphilia. That's the term we're using right now. But if it's not an orientation and the construct of paraphilia can't be supported scientifically, what then? What do we call it then? And how do we research it then? And that has a whole host of implications, value judgments, etc. Is it normative or non-normative? Is it adaptive or non-adaptive? Right now, they're classifying anything that's outside of what's adaptive evolutionarily as non-adaptive. for now. And if it's non-adaptive, why? Is it, a targeting error? Is it genetic? And we talked about that on the podcast before about the genetics of sexual behavior. So there's a lot to think about here, which I say that in every episode, but there's always a lot to think about. So these are really interesting questions. Are paraphilias sexual orientations, or are they not? Are they adaptive or non-adaptive? And if so, why? And if not, why? If they're not classified as paraphilias, what do we classify them as? If it's a targeting error, where does that come from? Is it a genetic thing? More questions. That's the great thing about science. There's always more questions. So I'm going to leave you with that today as I down more caffeine to feed the activity that's going on in my brain right now. P.S. Tai Chi is awesome. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments under the video if you're a sex researcher. I'm diving back into forensics here in the next few weeks, which I'm super excited about. I just love forensic sexology. So I guess this is kind of the start of that. And with that, I'm going to leave you with that brain twister for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Sex Nerd Podcast. Just a tip with Dr. Vic. And I will be diving headfirst into your all's brains next time.